Before we begin, I'd like to request our guest of honor, Professor Dr. Sugata Bose and Professor Dr. Raja Rasia, our moderator for this evening, to please be on stage. Your seats are there. Namaskar, Namaskaram, Salam Hormat. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sri Kala Nambiar and I'll be taking you through this evening's event. On behalf of the Asia-Europe Institute, University Malaya, and the Malaysia-India Heritage Society, let me extend a very warm welcome to each and every one of you here to this public lecture on Asia after Europe in the first session, and what do Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's political and socio-cultural beliefs mean for multi-ethnic societies in the second session. We are indeed very honored and privileged to have with us the eminent Professor Dr. Sugata Bose as our guest speaker, and our very own renowned distinguished Professor Dr. Raja Rasia as the moderator for both topics. Round of applause, you can clap now. Thank you. Not that these two gentlemen need any introduction, nevertheless I have a job to do. Professor Dr. Sugata Bose comes with all things Netaji readily embedded in his DNA by virtue of being Netaji's grandnephew. He is the first Asian to be appointed to the prestigious Gardner Chair of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University in 2001, the previous two being historians of the West. Among his many accomplishments, he was recipient of the coveted Guggenheim Fellowship in 1997. His publications range from his domains of expertise, that is, modern South Asian and Indian Ocean history, dynamics of political economy, culture, and social change, nationalism, capitalism, colonialism, or rather empire, as he prefers to often put it, to Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, and Netaji. I'm quite sure the latest of his many books and publications, titled Asia After Europe, Decline and Rise of a Continent, will be part of his lecture today. Ladies and gentlemen, on a side note, I'm indeed delighted to warmly welcome the gracious presence of our learned professor's brother, Professor Sumantra Bose, Professor Dr. Sumantra Bose, a political scientist and professor at the London School of Economics. Thank you, Prof. Our moderator for today's lecture is none other than Professor Dr. Raja Rasia, Distinguished Professor of Economics and Executive Director at the Asia-Europe Institute of Universiti Malaya. Hailed as one of the top authorities in government economic and industrial policies in the region, he is a recipient of numerous Malaysian and international awards. In a summary of summaries of the illustrious Professor's Star-Spangled CV available online, which, believe me, ladies and gentlemen, quite a daunting task for me, the multifaceted maestro of academia earned his doctorate in economics from Cambridge University and was a Rajawali Fellow at Harvard University. He is a recipient of the Celso Furtado Prize from the World Academy of Sciences for advancing the frontiers of social science thought in economics. This global pioneer in the economics of innovation and development is also a recipient of the Merdeka Award for Scholastic Achievement. Another round of applause, please. Ladies and gentlemen, today's lecture is organized jointly by the Asia-Europe Institute of Universiti Malaya and the Malaysia-India Heritage Society, the latter which was founded in 2017 by its current president, Mr. Prabhakaran Nair, under the auspices of the Indian High Commission in Kuala Lumpur. Mr. Prabhakaran Nair, an ex-director of the National Hero Center within the National Archives of Malaysia, is also an author, social scientist, a research consultant in the Parliament of Malaysia, and an avid historian, to name a few. To brief us on the Malaysia-India Heritage Society's objectives and to put it into context with our lectures today, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to call upon its founder-president, Mr. Prabhakaran Nair, to address us.
Distinguished Professor Dr. Raja Rasaya, Head of Asia Europe Institute, University, Malaya, Professor Dr. Sugata Bose, our chief guest today, Professor Dr. Sumantra Bose, Director of Netaji Research Bureau, Calcutta, His Excellency Mr. Dato B.L. Kandan, Tan Sri Palan, Mr. Raj Pandey, representative of the Thai Bharat Cultural Lodge, Bangkok, members of the Netaji Foundation, especially Mr. Subbanarayanasamy, INA veteran, and the president of Netaji Foundation, Mr. Radhakrishnan, members of the Malaysia-India Heritage Society and Group, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. The Malaysia-India Heritage Society is privileged indeed to join hands with the Asia Europe Institute of the University of Malaya in organizing today's program, occasioned by the visit of Professor Sugata Bose and his brother, Professor Dr. Sumantra Bose, to Singapore. My thanks to our dear members, His Excellency Mr. Keshwapani from Singapore, as well as Mr. B.L. Kandan, for ensuring that we in neighboring Malaysia do not miss out on the opportunity to host our distinguished scholar in Malaysia. Today's event is divided into two parts, of which the first part delves into Pan-Asianism as a compelling alternative to Western dominance, a topic that aligns closely with the objectives of the Asia Europe Institute. The second part will be on the legacy of openness left behind by Subhash Chandra Bose, who is none other than the grand uncle of Professor Sugata Bose. Both subjects resonate with our objective of forging a shared historical narrative between Malaysia and India. The first lecture relates to us in the sense that Professor Sugata will stand forth in the distinguished line of intellectuals and activists from Bengal who have articulated their views on Pan-Asianism on Malayan soil. The first was Rabindranath Tagore, who graced our shores nearly 100 years ago. Tagore, an icon of the Pan-Asian movement, presented Pan-Asianism as a remedy for the moral failings of Western civilization. In 1961, Tunku Abdul Rahman, our first Prime Minister, commemorated Tagore's centenary, stating, "The greatness of Tagore is not confined to India. He belongs to Asia and the world." Tagore championed cultural rapprochement between communities, societies, and nations long before it became a global norm. Tagore's vision finds expression in one of the core beliefs of the Malaysia-India Heritage Society, that cultural diplomacy is an avenue for bridging nations together in peace and harmony on the road to world peace. much had changed between the time of Tagore's visit to Malaya and the outbreak of World War II. During the war, two sons of Bengal, Rash Behari Bose and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, arrived in Malaya to fight for Indian independence, and in the process supported the ideal of Asia for the Asians and East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Their primary motivation, however, was the liberation of India from British rule. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject of Pan-Asianism did not end there. It continued to be given serious consideration by independent India, which recognized Asian solidarity for the potential it held for world peace. Nehru took the lead in organizing the Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi, which was attended by a number of Malaysians who had the last opportunity to meet Mahatma Gandhi before his assassination in the following year. Friends, we would be remiss if we didn't take the opportunity of Professor Sugata's visit to address the profound impact Netaji has had on the hearts and minds of the people of this country. Thus, as mentioned, we have included a second segment to this program where Professor Sugata will deliver a compelling and authoritative discussion on his granduncle or his great-uncle, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Drawing from extensive research and personal insights, Professor Sugata will illuminate Netaji's ideals and vision, often diverging from politically influenced narratives, to highlight Netaji's advocacy for secularism and communal harmony among diverse ethnic and religious groups. Thank you, and please enjoy the lectures.
Thank you, Mr. Prabha. I'd now like to call upon Associate Professor Dr. Roy Anthony Rogers, Deputy Executive Director of Development, Research and Innovation at the Asia-Europe Institute, University of Malaya, to do the introduction to the first session.
Salam Sejahtera and Namaste to our honorable speaker, Professor Dr. Sugata Bose, distinguished Professor Dr. Raja Rasya, Executive Director and Moderator for this afternoon session. On behalf of the Asia-Europe Institute, Universiti Malaya, I would like to welcome each and every one of you today for the public lecture. We are indeed very fortunate to have Professor Sugata Bose with us to address on the topic of Asia after Europe and what Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose political and social cultural belief mean for multi-ethnic society. I won't go further in that because Prof will be addressing on the issue. I'm sure you all come for his talk, so I will not go more than that. Asia-Europe Institute, or the AEI, has been in existence for more than 20 years. It offers postgraduate programs, including PhD, Masters in ASEAN Studies, and Masters in European Studies. In recent years, AEI has hosted eminent speakers and ambassadorial public lectures, such as we had the Ambassador of Spain, South Africa, to name a few. And today, we have the very honorable, or we are indeed very honored to have Professor Dr. Sugata. Again, on behalf of the Asia-Europe Institute, I would like to welcome you, and for all those who have taken time and sacrificed your Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening for this lecture. I'm sure you will not regret and you will benefit a lot from that. So thank you very much. Terima kasih. Dhanyawad. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought I was going to be introduced. Professor Sugata Bose, Deputy Director of AEI, Dr. Anthony Rogers, Mr. Prabhakaran, the Honorable Prabhakaran, who's the President of the Malaysia-India Heritage, Tantris, Dato, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure you will hear the thunder as I return to sit beside him afterwards. I just thought of locating his speech. He's not going to take that long. He's actually among speakers. I just want to speak for 30 minutes to see, really, to see what you are expecting of him. So he's expecting more questions. But the first lecture, and I'll focus on that for the moment now, will touch on his book, Asia After Europe. The lecture offers Sugata Bose's interpretation of the changing balance of global power over the long 20th century between Asia and Euro-America. In the discussion, you will also see America, opting to glean the spatial and temporal shape of Asia as a connected zone, which is a history of intellectual, cultural, and political conversations across Asia, imagining in the process a pluralized continentalism against the backdrop of phases of material poverty and prosperity. It provides a fresh perspective on Asianism targeted at those who challenge European colonialism and those who dream about the future after that, which is post-colonialism. I just wanted to extend a few lines there. It's a bit like, as these countries were facing, especially Asia, since it's focused on Asia, independence, we saw the emergence of the Cold War, a bipolar political system in which there were two big powers and their allies. But what came out in 1991 when Gorbachev decided to come across like a very blunt, frank statement that the experiment failed, while not acknowledging that the capitalist world had succeeded. In fact, I was at Cambridge listening to Mandela and him speaking on BBC. But my own impressions are that he stuck to his promise that Warsaw Pact will end in 91, and the dismantling of the Soviet economic system will also ensue from that. You can actually look at the book by Michael Ellman and Vladimir Kantorovich. The book talks about the disintegration of the Soviet economic system. The first one I read when Michael Ellman spoke in 92, and of course the revised version in Routledge in 98. But what we're seeing now is an extension without a recognition of what Mandela thought would happen. Mandela, after being released from prison, had the courage and the intelligence to make a point: unless we have a more egalitarian world, this is not going to end there. He made it very blunt in the BBC. And what opportunity that Gorbachev started with was all undermined, and we have this famous book, The End of History, by Francis Fukuyama, talking about triumphalist capitalist society that's going to dominate the world. But what we see now is the emergence of China, and the attempt by the hegemony to contain China, and of course the problems we're facing with Russia. And at the same time, we are not only seeing a powerful China that managed to take out 700 million people from 1978, the economic reforms that was undertaken during Deng Xiaoping. It started from there. Until 2022, they had already lifted 700, unprecedented in history. And then, of course, the emergence of India. So, without taking much of the thunder from, of course, the globally renowned Professor Sugata Bose, I shall now call upon, because he's got slides to show, to present his talk. Thank you.
Let's go back one. Great. Namaskar, Salam Alaikum, Professor Raja Rasaya, Mr. Prabhakaran Nayar, Professor Anthony Rogers, Ambassador Kesav Pani, distinguished guests. I'm delighted to be here at the Asia Europe Institute and to be hosted both by you, Professor Rasaya, and the Malaysia India Heritage Society. And I'm truly thankful to my very dear friend, Ambassador Kesavapani, for making sure that I could revisit Malaysia after a gap of many years. I have been speaking about my new book, Asia After Europe, at several venues in America, Europe, and Asia. But I haven't yet spoken at a more appropriately named institute. It's a true delight to be able to speak on Asia After Europe at the Asia Europe Institute here in Malaysia. I will try to give you a visual evocation of Asia After Europe. The book actually has quite a lot of economic history and discussion of political economy, but I'm going to slightly disappoint Professor Rasaya by focusing on the artistic and the cultural and the political, at least in my opening remarks. I would be happy to answer questions about the changing economic global balance of power as well. This is a book which narrates and interprets the creative process of imagining Asia by tracking the intersecting journeys of Asian intellectuals, artists, and anti-colonial activists during the long 20th century, by which I mean a period from the 1880s all the way to the present. In the year 1903, Abanindranath Tagore, a nephew of the poet Rabindranath, who has already been mentioned, removed a huge European oil painting from the wall of his studio and sold it to a wealthy art collector. He did this in order to make space for an Asian work of art to be executed by Yokoyama Taikkan, who had followed Okakura Tenshin's trail to India. The chosen theme was Rash Leela, the love play of Radha and Krishna on a moonlit night. Within a few days, Taikkan had completed his painting, but he was not satisfied. He kept saying that something is missing. One day, he arrived at the Tagore mansion and saw that the women had collected shiuli, a white autumnal flower, and the breeze had blown the flowers all across the room. Taikkan collected all the flowers, sprinkled them on his canvas in great delight, and then he took one flower, looked at it very closely, and then began applying the white and orange colors. Soon, the painting came alive with a rain of flowers from the sky. He made sure that he put a shiuli garland around Radha's neck. He curled the flowers around Krishna's flute as well. And then he framed the painting with a baluchari sari border. Then the painting was put up on the wall and a party was thrown for friends to come and enjoy Rash Leela. So this was the painting. The original seems to be lost, but I found a very high quality reproduction in an early 20th century art journal called Rupam. The process of mutual understanding and learning through artistic conversations across Asia unfolded gradually. Yokoyama Taikan and Hishida Shunso embraced Indian themes in their works. Taikan painted the goddess Kali, and Hishida Shunso painted Saraswati. And these paintings were bought by Rabindranath's sister, Swarnakumari Devi. Both were adorned with lotuses, which you can see at the bottom of this painting of Saraswati. Having observed Taikan soak his paintings in water, Abanindranath took the plunge himself and was impressed with the beautiful effect it had on his canvas. From that moment onwards, the Japanese wash became an intrinsic element in Indian painting. In 1905, Abanindranath painted an arresting image of the mother nation in that style, which was initially titled Bongo Mata, Mother Bengal, but later retitled as a gift to the Indian nation as a whole as Bharat Mata. So as you can see, this is a quintessentially Swadeshi, own country image, but it has absorbed an influence from outside, another part of Asia. Now, if the links of the Swadeshi era of 1905 were primarily cultural, suffused with an anti-colonial spirit, World War I afforded the opportunity for youthful daring on both intellectual and political planes. There was a fascinating young scholar from Bengal, Binoy Kumar Sarkar, who traveled through Southeast Asia and spent nearly 15 months in East Asia, in both Japan and China. And he wrote detailed travelogues in that period. He had met the Japanese scholar of Buddhism, Masaharu Anesaki, at Harvard. He was from Tokyo Imperial University. In Japan, he met Hattori Unokichi, a scholar of Chinese philosophy and literature, who had spent time at Beda, Peking University, and was poised to come to Harvard in place of Anesaki. Sarkar wondered in his travelogue whether the plans of a professor of philosophy at Harvard called James Horton Woods of bringing professors from India to Harvard would ever materialize. And of course, it had to wait for quite a few decades for that to happen. In August 1915, after spending several months in Japan, Binoy Sarkar mused, "What have I seen in Japan?" His reflections in answer to that question underscore a dramatic contrast between his travel experiences in Asia and Euro-America. In England and America, I understood the language of the people. I could converse with them in their mother tongue. Yet I felt oddly out of place. Kapchara was the Bengali word used in those societies. I have not understood the language of the men and women of Japan, yet standing on any street, in any city or village, I have felt as if I have been watching the scenes of Calcutta. In its heart and mind, Japan is a part of Asia. It has only imported some scraps of iron from Euro-America. Now, it was this feeling oddly out of place in Euro-America that was depicted in Florine Stettheimer's oil painting, Studio Party. In it, you see Binoy Sarkar is placed as an exotic fig leaf in front of Florine's self-portrait on the wall of a studio in New York. The intellectual engagement with Euro-America and the affective bond with Asia represented distinct modes of internationalist belonging of a colonized Indian intent on shaping a global future. He wrote a book which was titled The Futurism of Young Asia. Even more fascinating was what Binoy Sarkar had to say in his book dedicated to Kang Yu Wei and Liang Qiqiao about Chinese Muslims and the role of Islam in undergirding Asian unity. Okakura had theorized in 1903 about the Buddhist arc that connected Asia. Sarkar was fascinated to meet Muslims in China, coming from Bengal, a district which had almost an equal population of Hindus and Muslims. And he wrote, "The music that sprang from my heart strings as soon as I encountered Muslims here, why did it not sound on the same strings when I met the Chinese and Japanese Buddhist worshippers of Shakushingho?" And then he had a lyrical passage about the intimacy of Hindus and Muslims in Bengal. And of course, he made a powerful case for Hindu-Muslim unity in the cause of India's freedom. The 1920s witnessed the interplay of multiple universalisms in an age of mass nationalism. Asian nationalisms, including Indian nationalism, were never fully territorially bounded. So there were connections that were forged with Islamic universalism, the Khilafat movement during Gandhi's non-cooperation, the Bolshevik internationalism of Lenin post-1917. But Asia was one expansive venue for the play of what I call colorful cosmopolitanisms, a kind of cosmopolitanism which was not antithetical to patriotism. You could love your own country, but you could also forge cultural connections with others. In 1924, exactly 100 years ago, Rabindranath Tagore traveled through Southeast Asia to China and Japan. He had made his first voyage in 1916. In those days, if you traveled by ship, whether from Calcutta or Madras, you would first come to Rangoon, and then you would go to Penang, and then you would come down the Malay Peninsula, go around Singapore, and on to East Asia. So that was the route that had been followed. Liang Qiqiao warmly welcomed Tagore at a reception in Peking. But not everyone was as effusive as Liang in welcoming Tagore, and that was because the May 4th generation often misunderstood Tagore as somebody who advocated a kind of spirituality of the past, even though Tagore tried to establish or assert his modern credentials in his various speeches. As a result, Tagore's message of the intrinsic relationship between beauty and hospitality had a friendlier reception in Japan than in China. There was a painter called Nandolal Bose who had the privilege of being hosted by Taikkan in Japan. In fact, there is a beautiful sketch by Nandolal, which I haven't brought for you today, unfortunately, of Tagore in Penang. It's a lovely sketch, and you might want to find it. Now, in 1924, there was another important visit by Sun Yat-sen of China to Japan, and he made a very major speech in Kobe in November of 1924. And there are deep similarities between what Tagore had said in mid-1924 and Sun Yat-sen said in Japan in late 1924. Sun Yat-sen actually referred to a book by an unnamed American scholar. Now, that scholar happens to be a man called Lothrop Stoddard, who had a BA and a PhD from Harvard University. But this was an area this was an era of Asian exclusion in the United States. In 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act was passed, which was popularly referred to as the Orientals Exclusion Act. And Stoddard's books had contributed to this kind of exclusionary politics. He had first written a book in 1920, which was called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. And Mark Mazawa, the historian at Columbia University, has noted how it really captured the international mood in the West at that time. And then in 1922, he wrote another book called The Revolt Against Civilization, The Menace of the Underman. And Sun Yat-sen said in response that this American scholar regards the awakening of Asia to be a revolt against civilization. And using that as a point of departure, Sun Yat-sen talked about how there were civilizations and civilizations. And he advocated the kingly way rather than the despotic way, the kingly way of sharing power, spreading beneficence instead of tyranny, and so forth. And he asked the Japanese to make a choice. Do they want to pursue the spirit of Asian universalism, or will they imitate European nationalistic imperialism? Now, if the streams of Asian universalism and communist internationalism diverged from 1927 onwards, and this has been shown by Tim Harper, who was here just last week in his book, Underground Asia, the intermingling of Asian and Islamic universalisms had a much longer afterlife than might have been expected following the Turkish abolition of the Khilafat in 1924. And no one gave more eloquent expression to a different universalism of Muslims in South and West Asia than the great poet philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, who attended the second Mu'tamar al-Alam al-Islami in Jerusalem in November of 1931. Of course, Palestine dominated the discussions because the Palestinians had already started to lose their lands to Zionists at that point. What Iqbal argued in 1931 was that the specter of pan-Islamism had been conjured up in the fertile imagination of a lone French journalist. And Iqbal proposed dropping the pan from the phrase as Islamism sufficed. And much the same can be said at this time about the needless prefix attached to the sentiments of Asianism. Now, if you think about the 1930s, it was a decade of a worldwide economic depression. And many of the movements, the mobility of people that had taken place across Asia was arrested, if not reversed, in that period. There was a collapse in agricultural prices, there was a drying up of credit, and so on. And yet, there were Asian women's conferences being held in that decade, Asian labor congresses being convened, and so forth. And what we also see in this period is how there were European-style nationalist conflicts that came to afflict Asia. And the most important of these, of course, was Japan's invasion of the Chinese mainland in 1937. And so what we see, this is, of course, Iqbal in Jerusalem. There were African-American intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, who came in 1936 to Japan and China. And he did not fully condemn Japan's aggression because he had a realist political analysis of the situation in Asia and suggested that Japan had to be assertive if Euro-America was not to take over China. And he basically thought in terms of the unity of oppressed peoples across the entire world. But then in India, where there were many figures who had really admired China, admired Japan from the turn of the 20th century, who decided that their sympathies lay with China in 1937, 1938. So here you see a picture of Subhash Chandra Bose sending off the Indian medical mission from Calcutta. And in the next picture, you see these Indian doctors with Mao Zedong in Yan'an in early 1939. And there had been a deep friendship between the two poets, Rabindranath Tagore and Yuane Noguchi, going back to the early 20th century. But they had something of a falling out in 1938 because of their differing interpretations of the Japan-China conflict. In November 1935, Noguchi had been given a warm reception in Shantiniketan by Tagore. But then there was an exchange of letters that took place in 1938, which I discuss in this book. It was about this time, well, a little later, in 1940, that the famous Chinese painter Xu Beihong came and spent time in Shantiniketan and interacted with the artists there. Here is his portrait of Tagore. He also did a wonderful sketch of Gandhi. The expression on Gandhi's face has hardly been better captured by an artist than in this one by Xu Beihong. But he did portraits, but also landscapes. He then traveled to Darjeeling. He went and painted the Kanchenjunga, the Himalayas, as viewed from Darjeeling. In the period of war and famine, which I discuss in great detail in this book, the artistic milieu in Shantiniketan had to respond to these multiple crises. And here you see a painting by Nandalal Bose titled Annapurna. In a combination of tempera and Japanese wash, Nandalal created the haunting image of Annapurna and Rudra in 1943. In this famine, well over 3 million people died, even though there was no aggregate food shortage. Annapurna, who is seated on a lotus, holds a bowl of rice in her hands. Before her stands Shiva, reduced to a skeleton, holding a begging bowl. While famine was ravaging Bengal, Subhash Chandra Bose had arrived in Southeast Asia. This is the 5th of July, 1943, where he, in Singapore, in front of the City Hall, he's taking the salute as Supreme Commander of the Indian National Army, and in front of him on the Padang, there were 12,000 soldiers of the Azad Hind Fauj. I discuss the war period in great detail, and one of the themes that I focus on is how Asian freedom movements got to know one another better during this particular period, especially between 1943 and 1945. And here you see Subhash Chandra Bose in Rangoon. In fact, he arrived in Singapore and then he traveled all across Malaya. He electrified audiences and with his call for total mobilization. And he visited Thailand, and then he was in Burma by late July and early August of 1943 when this particular photograph was taken. Subhash Chandra Bose knew that so far as India and Japan were concerned, poetry and paintings had been very much a part of the relationship that had been forged since the turn of the 20th century. So even in the middle of a world war, when he was in Tokyo in November 1943, he made it a point to visit the Ueno Museum of Art. And here he is with Abid Hassan, who was his only Indian companion on the submarine voyage from Europe to Asia, and Ananda Mohan Sahai, who was actually a close colleague of Rashbihari Bose in the Indian Independence League. There they are with Netaji viewing Japanese art in 1943. Now, after the end of the war, the idea of building an Asian federation was still alive. Our grandfather, Sharath Chandra Bose, traveled to Rangoon and met Aung San in July of 1946, and both articulated their visions of an Asian federation in the not so distant future in a public gathering in Rangoon City Hall. And this was soon followed by what has already been mentioned, the Asian Relations Conference. In fact, it was presided over by Sarojini Naidu, and she is the one who made the most eloquent speeches there. And she said, you know, who wants a uniform culture? Who wants a monotonous culture? So she was a quintessential, colorful cosmopolitan, a patriot, but at the same time arguing that one can build a larger Asian cultural ecumene and a political federation. She too talked the language of an Asian federation in 1947. And of course, as was mentioned by Mr. Prabhakaran Nair, Gandhi was there at the Asian Relations Conference, and there were many Asian leaders who got an opportunity to meet him in person less than a year before he was tragically assassinated. There were many unofficial and semi-official Asian conferences that were held in many different parts of Asia in the course of the 1950s. This was a replica of a mural by Diego Rivera, Nightmare of War, Dream of Peace, that adorned the backdrop of a Beijing meeting for an Asia-Pacific Peace Conference. And even though politics was discussed, the Malayan emergency figured, prominently in the discussions at that time. But there were informal opportunities for intellectuals and artists to talk to one another. One of the delegates who had gone to Beijing for this particular conference was the artist Maqbul Fida Hussain. And he was a great admirer of Chibai Shi, whom he described as the Matisse of Asia, the master of ink painting in China. And the other artist whom he really admired was Xu Beihong, none other than the person who had spent time in Shantiniketan. He went to Xu Beihong's studio and was absolutely mesmerized by Xu Beihong's 1,000 horses. And that is what inspired Hussain to lend new vigor to his own horses from that time onwards. So what we find at this time is that artistic genius had vaulted across the Himalayas. But less than a decade after this kind of an expression of bonhomie, India and China would be fighting a border war in the Himalayas. And this is a photograph I took of the Sila, a pass in Arunachal Pradesh, where some of the conflict played out in 1962. And I have an interpretation as to why this happened. How post-colonial states, instead of drawing on the best in anti-colonial Asian thought, decided to hold on to European notions of unitary sovereignty and hard borders. And this is what led to war and conflict in this particular period. And yet, even at the moment of this of rivalry and conflict between nation states, an intellectual quest began to discover what a Japanese scholar of Chinese literature, Takeuchi Yoshimi, evocatively called in a 1960 lecture, Asia as Method. In the early 1960s, Nandolal Bose, who had accompanied Tagore on his Asian voyage in 1924, celebrated the Indian countryside in his art in the Japanese sumie style. And of course, Japan continues to inspire art across Asia even today. Here is a recent luminous example titled The Bridge from Shahid Jalal's exhibition, Memories of Japan, that opened in Lahore in May 2022. So this landscape, which I think of as an Asian landscape, is, what I try to write about in my book. I will, conclude by saying that I have chosen to shift from an academic prose in the early part of my book to some personal reflections in the later chapters. And that is because I felt that I needed to ask and address the question that, what should we choose from legacies of the past in our uncertain journey ahead as Asians? And in this context, I will just end by reading, I look at the most recent period, both in economic terms and political and cultural dimensions as well, the period from 1979 onwards, which is often referred to as the period of the rise of Asia. And I have my own interpretation of this particular rise. But I'll end, because I'm standing here in Malaysia, by reading a paragraph from my book, which draws on a beautiful travelogue cum history by our mother, Krishna Bose, titled Chorono Rekhatobo, Your Footprints. And this will probably be a good link between the first and second sessions that have been planned for today. Both our parents, Shishir Kumar Bose and Krishna Bose, had come to Malaysia in 1979. They traveled to Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and Bangkok. So let me pick up where they talk about Kuala Lumpur. My mother writes, and in Kuala Lumpur, the veterans of the INA gathered for a lunch meeting in a restaurant called The Bangles to relive their wartime adventures with their Indian guests. Datin Janaki Thevar Athinahappan, who as a teenager had donated her earrings and bangles and gone with the Rani of Jhansi regiment to Burma, narrated her experiences of the retreat with Netaji from Rangoon in April 1945. Amerik Singh Gill had landed as a secret agent of the INA by submarine in India and recalled his escape from a prison van in Calcutta after receiving a death sentence in a secret trial by the British upon capture. And I must say that I'm very glad that these martyrs, nearly 24 of them, who were executed, are being remembered in Malaysia today. Satyavati Thevar Naidu, who commanded the Singapore unit of the Women's Regiment after Lakshmi Swaminathan moved forward to Burma, had by now lost her sight, but tears flowed from her sightless eyes when she met the Boses at dinner. Janaki sang a patriotic song composed by Qazi Nazrul Islam that Netaji had taught the leading figures of the women's movement. The song was Durgamogiri Kantar Muru Dustaro Parabar. The visiting Indians were bombarded with questions at a press conference by journalists of the Malaysia New Straits Times, the Malay Mail, and other newspapers. In a sign of the New Times, Chen Thiu Yang of the Malay Mail asked whether Asian history was being properly written. Mostly Western scholars were writing Asian history. Could they have any empathy with Asia's freedom struggle? And even if they did, was it possible for those from another culture to offer a correct interpretation? Indians in Malaysia, despite being a minority, had acquired a measure of economic prosperity and political power. a mass meeting was held one day at the headquarters of the Malay Indian Congress. An announcement by a cabinet minister, Datun Samivelu, that the new auditorium being built by the Congress would be named after Netaji drew thunderous applause from the gathering. Indians in Thailand were as enthusiastic as their counterparts in Malaysia about the wartime anti-colonial movement. The Thai Bharat Cultural Lodge provided the venue for a large meeting with veterans of the freedom struggle led by Ishwar Singh Narula, who along with Debnath Das had represented Thailand's Indian community in the Azad Hind government. Netaji last visited Bangkok on August 16-17, 1945. Krishna Bose learned with profound regret that a perfectly good plan for Bose to go underground in Thailand was rejected for a far riskier one as the war wound down to a close. Now, there is no question that in the 4 decades from 1979 to 2019, there has been an unmistakable economic rise of Asia, and the global balance of power that had shifted against Asia in the early 19th century has at least been partially redressed. But what do we do with this rise? And here I will go back to Rabindranath Tagore, who during a visit to Iran in 1932 had pondered over the prospect of the rise of Asia. He wrote, "We are the people of Asia. Grievances against Europe are in our blood." That's because of what Europe had done to Asia from the late 18th century onwards. If a new age has dawned in Asia, let Asia give it utterance in a new, authentic voice. If instead Asia merely imitates Europe's beastly cry, were it even to be the lion's roar, it will be a loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Sugata Bose, for the descriptive and enlightening talk, which ended most beautifully and nostalgically with the read from your book. I'd now like to hand over to Professor Dr. Rajarasaya to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you. In contrast to the disappointment that Professor Sugata Bose expected from a so-called economist, I must say I was fascinated. Although I did formal history until 15, from the Form 3 equivalent in Malaysia, but it's just like, I've even quoted, I think Sulvaratnam will know that, Utsa Patnaik's work, where she actually mentions that the British took away something like 45 trillion US dollars while they colonized India from 1765. So, yeah. And so, I must say, I think most of them here are fascinated that this set of historical lenses used to capture the intellectual, cultural, and political conversations. I thought was really interesting. And I think a person I remembered when you said that is Sulvaratnam's late wife. In the launching of her book on art, she actually says the same thing. She actually says the same thing, art should be understood through music, through painting, and a whole range of other things. And that's the sort of thing I heard from you, and thank you on that. We don't really have time, but it's already past 5 now. I shall open for 2 questions, but remember that although this topic seemingly did not appear to bring Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, but we already heard the conversations documented by Professor Sugata Bose that dabbled on a number of things he's done, including his scintillating speech in the Padang in Singapore, the great oratorship that he showed. So we can actually have most of the questions after the second session, since it's very much time. So can we have, in case, yeah, Hamdan, since you have to leave.
It's too loud. Prof, I think it's a wonderful, like what I call journey through time, and connecting both in terms of the deep intellectual connections expressed through ideas and art. I wanted to, while you have written about Asia after Europe, someone prior, Ken Chowdhury, had written Asia before Europe. And the whole thesis of that was about trade and civilization in the Indian Ocean. And I think your prior work also had touched some aspects of this, in a sense that we've seen the what they call the importance of a larger trading system that had existed prior to Europe's presence. As the world shifts, sure, as the world shifts, as we see now with the shift in terms of a relationship between US and China and others, will there be a much stronger Asia response? Because currently there is a kind of a, you can call it intellectual vacuum that is not present in Asia in terms of the likes of what you have mentioned, or the personalities. So I don't know your thoughts.
To answer this or take the second question?
Yeah, the second question and answer so that we can
Any questions?
Yes.
Just one more question.
Yeah.
That's okay. We can have the question.
We can have the questions after the second session, as Raja Rasaya has mentioned. So let me address Hamdan's very, very pertinent question. The title of my book, Asia After Europe, is a deliberate play on K.N. Chowdhury's classic work, Asia Before Europe. Now, most historians of the Indian Ocean and Asian connections had concentrated on the pre-modern and the early modern period. K.N. Chowdhury's book, among others, ends around 1750 or at most 1800. He looks at the millennium from the rise of Islam up to about 1750 or 1800. And in an earlier book, 100 Horizons, I had actually tried to take forward Indian Ocean history into the 19th and 20th centuries. And so in some ways, my method echoes that of K.N. Chowdhury, whom Shumantra and I met in Avignon only last month in June, in the sense that I try to somehow blend the study of political economy and culture in this work, Asia After Europe. I use this phrase, Asia After Europe, in at least two senses. First, of course, I'm writing about Asia as a connected zone after the imposition of European imperial domination. Particularly, I would say you can date it to the second decade of the 19th century. That is when you have the great divergence in the economic fortunes of Europe and Asia. There was nothing ancient about Asia's poverty. And in fact, K.N. Chowdhury, among others, had showed how economically dynamic the entire Indian Ocean interregional arena had been up to that point. So in a chronological sense, I'm talking about Asia after Europe, but much more importantly, I'm trying to advance a conceptual argument about the possibility of an Asia after Europe. Asian conceptions of universalism and cosmopolitanism, which are very different from European conceptions of reason and national identity. And the point that you made was raised yesterday as well in Singapore by Kishore Mahabubani, that in political and economic terms, there has unquestionably been a rise of Asia. There has been a redressal of the global imbalance that began in the early 19th century. But we seem to have had greater intellectual figures arguing a case for Asianism or a spirit of Asian universalism with very different views on sovereignty and borders and so on, calling into question the nation state as the normative political unit in the colonial era, in the, for example, early 20th century, than we seem to have today. My only hope is that with books of the kind that I have written, that there will be a younger generation of Asians who will be inspired to provide the intellectual leadership, which in fact seems to be sadly missing at a very critical moment when the global balance of power is shifting in favor of the erstwhile colonized Asia. Thank you.
I think now I'll pass the cue back to the MC to close the current session, and then we'll come back for the second session.
Thank you, Professor. I'd now like to invite Professor Datuk Dr. Rajarasya to present a token of appreciation from the Asia-Europe Institute to Professor Dr. Sugata Bose. I'd also like to call upon Mr. Prabhakaran Nair, Founder President of the Malaysia-India Heritage Society, to receive one from Professor Dr. Rajarasya. Thank you, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take a brief 15-minute break for some refreshments. Please be back by 5:25 or earlier better, so that we can move on to our next session. Okay.